Welcome to Guardians of the Data. I'm your host, Ward Balzerzak. Each episode will explore the passions, expertise, and real-world experiences of security leaders who are helping the future of data security and governance. Guardians of the Data is made possible by support from Centra. To learn more about our AI-powered data security platform, please visit centra.io. Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of Guardians of the Data. I'm your host, Ward Balzerzak. I've got a great guest today. He has nearly 30 years of experience in engineering and cybersecurity, currently the Associate Professor and Director of the Cybersecurity Defense and Information Assurance Program at Temple University. Derek Fisher, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ward. Thank you for having me on, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, I'm excited for our conversation. So, you ready to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. In your professional opinion, what's the biggest data security challenge organizations are facing?
So I think for me, we collect a lot of data, right? And we look, and when I say we, I mean, technology organizations, and not even, technology specific organizations, but just organizations as a whole, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're Sherwin-Williams, selling paint, whether you're JP Morgan Chase, collecting information on your clients. All of that information is being sucked up. And I forget what the exact number is, but it's, some like 100 plus zettabytes of data is being collected every year. And every year that doubles, right? So all of this information that's being collected about ourselves, about our environment, the telemetry, how we use our devices, how we interact with services, and how we interact with the companies that we interact with, like what is happening with that data and what decisions are being made on that data. So from a cybersecurity perspective, a lot of times we think about how do we protect this information, how do we make sure that it doesn't get breached, or that we're not going to be put out of business due to a ransomware attack. And we focus on those types of aspects. But I think one thing that often doesn't get talked about, or not really doesn't rise to the same level, is how is that information being used to make decisions about the customers for companies. Like, how is that data being used to make decisions about them? How's healthcare information being used to make patient decisions? And even financial decisions, getting a loan or something like that, how that data being used. And that does tie back into, the security aspects of how do we ensure that the integrity of that data is maintained, so that the decision-making that occurs actually is not, hasn't been tampered with.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. And I agree, right? Just thinking back to myself, when I join an organization and start to build a data security program, I don't usually start with how data is being used to make decisions, right? I usually start with what data do we have? And that leads, many avenues, many conversations, many long days of all of that. But coming back to what you just said is the challenge, it's interesting because a lot of times, once I start finding out what our data is, I start to inevitably have those conversations of why. Why do we have that data? I'd like to say I front load that. Usually not the case, right? Usually I start looking to protect it, and then it's more retrospective. Why do we have it? What are we doing with it? So, in your experience, or with your expertise, how do you recommend folks start to figure that out, start to identify not only the what, but more importantly, the how that's being used?
Yeah, and I think this question. I remember early in my cybersecurity journey here that one of the things that really stuck in my head was, do we need this information? Right? Never collect data that you don't intend to use. And for a lot of reasons. One is that you don't have to protect that information, right? If you're a web application that hosts cat pictures or videos or something like that, you don't need to collect somebody's social security number, right? I mean, I know that's a very extreme case, but there's plenty of examples of where, do you need to collect this information? And if the answer is no, then don't collect it, right? And sometimes organizations will see that, well, we may need this in the future, right? That we're collecting this information because we may need it down the road, as we expand our features and things like that. And but that adds that additional attack surface. It adds an opportunity for an attacker to potentially, compromise that information, and you never even needed it, right? So I think that fundamental question of why, why do you need to collect this should be, question number one.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of going back to what you said about, there's plenty of companies that collect information because we might need it later. We might do this thing. Um, I myself, I've worked in the enterprise, I've worked in the consulting space, and I've worked in the vendor space. And something that was very eye-opening to me was services. I won't name them, but services that you or I would use in the enterprise that are collecting information about us as professionals, about our organizations, that then vendors, consulting agencies, and unfortunately also bad actors could actually use to start to map out how the organization's structured, what your responsibilities are, and what your technology is. Curious your thoughts about. I'm sure you've heard of those services that are out there. Curious your thoughts about those services and ones like it that just become kind of a dumping ground of what could be highly sensitive information when combined.
Yeah, and I go back to something that my old previous CISO had mentioned to me before, but it's like, those services that collect, especially for like employees of a company, right? You're collecting all kinds of information about, especially as we went to the work from home, model during the pandemic. We started installing all these, sort of spyware. There's a more elegant term for it, but we'll say spyware. That collects all the information on employees, and one of the things that I remember my previous CISO mentioning was that, what if somebody's looking, we do a lot of personal stuff on our work computer, and not necessarily like nefarious or malicious activity, but you may go search for things. And what if you search for like a cancer, cancer research because you just got a cancer diagnosis, right? That information, that's sensitive, right? And where's that information go? And when, or if, I should say, if and when that data gets, leaked or breached or sold or packaged, whatever the case is, what's the responsibility of the organization in terms of that type of information that's been collected about, an employee? And so, there is, I think, a fine line there between, finding out how effective and efficient your employees are versus overstepping your bounds and getting a little bit into some of the personal, aspects of people's lives. Now, of course, you have an acceptable use policy in most organizations that say you are being, essentially your activity on this, in your work device is being, monitored and potentially collected, used at your own risk. But I think, there's, we often forget that as humans. We forget that, and we think that especially if you're in your office or cube or even working remotely at your house, you often forget that you're still sort of having that information collected. And aside from that, we do that just in general. I mean, like if you look at any of the social media platforms that people use, all that information is being collected about us like on a daily basis. You certainly 100% can put together a profile about somebody, and infer, if not directly correlate, information that they're searching and the way they interact with the platform. You can gather enough information to build a profile about a person, and that can be, for in the wrong hands, that can be dangerous. So this week I was teaching at Temple University, and one of the classes we were going through, it was Google Glass was the video that we were watching. That's not really in vogue as much as it used to be, but basically the AR glasses and how it can overlay things within your view. and then also film and take audio and all this data that's being collected and you know being sent somewhere, right? And then potentially being sold, right? Be packaging sold to a third party. It's such a target rich environment. I just remember saying that during a class. It's like this: we are living in a time where it's such a target rich environment. When I was growing up, I remember my mom just saying like, "You never get your Social Security number out, never, and never give it out." Like, you rarely, gave out your phone number. Like everyone was paranoid about like data, getting out. Now it's like people willingly give it up, and so we're just living in a world and an environment where privacy has been blown out of the water a long time ago.
Totally agree. And I want to come back to that, but I want to go back a little bit to something else you said, which I think is very interesting. And that was your statements around employees doing stuff of a personal nature and that information might be getting captured. And I find that interesting, again, reflecting on some of my own roles in the past. The last couple organizations that I worked for, right in their acceptable use policy, they did say, because they wanted a culture of openness and work life balance and all that, but they did say personal use. They said limited, but that's always up to the eye of the beholder. Limited personal use is okay, right? So you're going to inevitably have using we blocked it for the most part, but we'll say, personal email, certainly go out and searching, health-based things. Interesting that you mentioned cancer. I've seen some of that. And, the thing that I personally haven't thought about there, which is a bummer being in data security, is, oh my goodness, there is potentially sensitive information that I am capturing and storing of a personal nature on my employees that I probably don't want because it's not interesting from a security perspective, but also that employee isn't really aware. Yes, they know they're being monitored, but they're not aware I'm storing. So bringing that back to your problem statement of how's data being used to make decisions, like what do you think about those organizations capturing that data? Like, do you have any thoughts and perspectives on maybe what they should do there, how they should treat it?
you know, and the wheels were kind of turning as you were talking too about just how like just kind of following that thought experiment through of like if you have, let's say you're a company that runs your own private health insurance and you see one of your employees like looking up cancer diagnosis, do you then again like with that information as the company, do you then start reevaluating whether you carry that individual in one policy, right? Because it's a high risk, right? So,
Oh,
and that's a very like sort of edge case. But if you look at like healthcare companies that do apply, that do have insurance policies, they are looking at that, right? They do want that information because they want to know, like, hey, is this a high risk policy or not? Um, to get back to what you were asking about, what does a company do about that? Retention periods matter, right? Maybe it's a classification tagging, say, hey, we don't need this information. To your point, like if it's not a security relevant type of capture, information capture, then to just toss it. That doesn't keep it out of the peering eyes of whoever saw that. But if you have, automation in place with classification that says, hey, this is a, sensitive PHI type of event here, as opposed to like, when somebody was searching, how to make a bomb or whatever, in the work system, those are kind of two different things. But I think that does depend on, classification and retention to figure out like, is this something that we actually need to capture, or is it something we can just toss and it has no relevance? Because you do as a company, companies have lawyers. I'm sure they can work their way around this, but that does open you up to a little bit of liability there in terms of like the information you're capturing there that has no relevance to technology or security.
yeah, and I know, I shouldn't say I know, but my experience has been, again, a lot of the companies I've worked with. they're super hyper focused on proprietary information, obviously, and customer or client data. Obviously, that all makes sense. But what usually takes a back seat, at least what I've seen, is employee data. I remember having this conversation at one of the organizations I worked for. We were talking about some data security controls. We were in the financial services industry, so we had a lot of sensitive data. And I remember calling out, we've got all this. How do we know the difference between employee data and customer data? And they're like, oh, well, we don't have any employee data in there. I'm like, okay, that's cool. So, let's wrap the controls that we need to around that. Let's have the proper visibility. And then I said, well, what about our employee data? And it was, oh, we don't care about that, right? That's not in scope. And I remember sitting there and thinking, like, I get the not in scope today arguments, kind of. Like, we definitely need to protect our external data that's coming in, our customer data, B2B, whatever. But in my opinion, the data security of employee data shouldn't take a back seat. I'm gonna guess you agree with that as well.
Yeah. I mean, and again, the wheels were kind of turning as we were talking there. And it's like, well, what if, again, we were talking about profiles, like, earlier, trying to figure out like a profile of an individual. And what if that sensitive data search that the employee was doing actually does have relevance? Maybe it does point to, um, potentially some trouble in that person's life that then leads them to become, a malicious insider. And maybe you do need that information to say, well, here's what led that individual to making, the decision that they were going to steal data and sell it on sell it to whatever. I mean, you can think about some of the different scenarios that, a malicious insider could do, but maybe that information is relevant, right? And so, but again, like this is why, right? This is why security is complicated. Like
Yeah,
security, because you just, there's always, um, and I think we're, if you agree with that, I think we are starting to talk ourselves into, well, maybe we do need that information. Maybe we should collect it and store it for, for that what if scenario. But
it's a catch 22, to your point there. And yes, guilty. I've definitely, as part of programs I build, there's usually been an insider risk facet to the programs I build. And there are certain risk indicators, like somebody going and applying for jobs. You would hope they're not doing that in their corporate asset, but I've seen it quite a bit. Um, and yeah, I would use, and my teams would use that telemetry to do, in some cases, enhanced monitoring of those individuals to make sure they're not going to be a malicious insider at some point, take data, go to a competitor or something like that. Um, the other thing that we've done, reflecting as we've been talking, is make risk-based decisions on the data we're decrypting, right? So again, going back to personal usage, it's really difficult in the packet flow sense to identify at that time what is personal, what is business, because there's a lot of overlap between those services. But one thing that we did do was, in partnership with our legal department and HR department, um, we made the decision to either decrypt or not decrypt, data transmissions to certain things like healthcare, as kind of the URL category. We weren't decrypting that, and other things like that. I mean, that could be a method some folks use to reduce that data sprawl that they might not want to accidentally collect.
yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, but that requires, a little, I mean, that to me, like, as you're talking about that, to me, it seems like that's a very mature approach to that, where, if you look at some organizations, and again, I was talking about that this week, during my classes I was teaching, is that, like, especially like healthcare companies, right? Or, healthcare IT departments, they're usually chronically understaffed, right? And the IT guy or the IT gal is like the security person, the IT person, the network person, all wrapped up in the one, right? And so that's where, and I'm giving that as a small example. I mean, there's plenty of companies out there, that have that type of, IT department where it's an army of one or just few, right? But what you're describing, I mean, absolutely does tackle that issue in terms of being able to categorize which domains fall into which categories and decisions made to say we're not going to decrypt versus going to pass through that information. I think that's a great way to tackle that.
And just as I said that before, I remembered a little bit of PTSD. I remembered again, former job. I had very long back and forth conversation with our audit department. Well, maybe not surprisingly enough. And again, going back to the decrypt versus not decrypt, we had made the determination that we were not going to decrypt the personal banking category. Kind of it goes back to like, we don't want to look at you're logging into your bank account and you're doing the stuff because that's information that we definitely didn't need. But I remember the audit team came back and said, well, that's a risk. And I was like, all right, walk me through why you think that's a risk. And their argument was, well, some of these banking sites have the ability where you can send an email. So if you're not decrypting that and they have the ability to do it, that could be a data exfil point. And I remember sitting there just thinking like, okay, yeah, I'm thinking to my own bank accounts, like, yes, I do have one system that could do that, but that's me sending data to my bank. Maybe I'm doing a loan or something like that. It's not me sending a bunch of intellectual property. I guess it could be out and around. So it was just interesting as we've been talking about this, that you can make some of those decisions to cut down on the data you're collecting to reduce what you have to protect. But as you do that, you really need to have a risk-based approach because you could blind yourself to certain avenues of data exfil or attack.
Yeah. And even, as we're talking about this, more, when we think about data sprawl, right? You think about and put yourself in a bank's shoes. Now you're in the security team of the bank, and somebody says, "Where's your data?" And it's like, well, this is the problem, right? Well, maybe it's on their employer's servers somewhere, and you don't know that, right? And I mean, again, that gets down to the whole kind of questions of when you ask an organization like, "Where's your data at?" They point to the database or the cloud, service provider, and say it's there, right? And maybe it's in a third party service that we use to do some kind of aggregation or whatever, But you don't think about like, oh well, the employee, this, customer of our bank is an employee of this company. They use the company's, resources to access our bank account, and it's maybe their bank account number is sitting on a server somewhere in the employer's database somewhere. And it's like, but again, like thinking more from the banking standpoint, the bank standpoint of like answering that question of where your data is, and again, that's an extreme case, but I think it shows the complexity of how this data is just sprawled, right? I mean, it's your information is just floating in ether everywhere, and it's very complicated for an organization to say definitively, here's where the information is here, and we can point to where it is. That's not always accurate.
Yeah, it's actually funny you said some of the words you said. I just did a presentation. Man, my days are all blending together, but I think it was last week at a symposium. And, part of my thesis was, data is amorphous, essentially. It's constantly flowing, it's moving quickly. It's like a river was really what it came down to. It's going everywhere. It's taking its own course in some cases, and it's taking the shape of wherever it's stored, number one, but it's also, in and of itself, it has its own risk tied to it. And it is then putting that risk on wherever it goes, essentially, right? Thinking about, the easy example is PCI data. Generally speaking, you're supposed to put, not supposed to, you are supposed to put controls, pretty tight controls around the PCI data. But if those controls aren't tight, that data is going to find a way out. And whether the organization likes it or not, congratulations. Now, if it's over in this location, you've got to put those same PCI controls on it. It's tough. It's tough for the organizations out there.
Yeah.
So I said I wanted to come back to it. You've mentioned a few times, and certainly in your role at the university there, you're teaching classes, right? You're teaching the next generation of defenders that are out there. Bringing it back to kind of data security, or maybe even just data awareness, like what are you doing in these courses to really kind of educate folks on these problems and challenges out there?
You know what? I think for me, teaching at the university, you have, again, they're students, right? But they're 19, 20, 21 years old, and like to put yourself, those of us that have been in engineering and security and all that for decades, like we take for granted some of the like early phases of our career where like your things are like eye opening to you, and maybe to us now we become sort of desensitized to things where it's just like, yeah, okay, I get it, but I think for me, like teaching this next generation of cyber individuals, or just technologists, it's about showing them sort of the entire picture, right? Of the I think one of the examples I gave was when we think about cybersecurity, especially like one of the courses that teaches software security. So when we think about software security, we're focused in on like the web app or the mobile app, and we say, okay, here's where we want to make sure that we protect against SQL injection and cross-site scripting, and make sure that we have title authentication and all that. But when you sort of pull out from that a bit, you realize that that application is running on a server in the cloud. It's containerized. It's being orchestrated by Kubernetes. It's got all these APIs that it's calling out to third-party services. The data is being, stored and replicated across multiple AZs, and then you have like the hardware itself that it's running on. Whether that's your own, or whether it's in cloud, cloud service provider, then it's somebody else's. But that's when we talk about full stack, right? And a couple of years ago, if you said full stack, you thought about somebody that knew UI and backend and database and maybe deployment and all that. But today, I think full stack, we have to picture that entire life cycle and that entire ecosystem that really comes down to just those workflows that are running on that software. And for us, it's kind of demystified, because like, okay, well, I go to my my banking website, I punch in my credentials, and it just shows my account. But everything that runs behind that is just a massive ecosystem. And we talk a lot about supply chain security, and how we ensure that each piece of our build is properly secured and all that. But again, like supply chain means every single piece of that, and we've seen plenty of examples of attackers being able to manipulate any single one of those moving parts to compromise the entire system. And so, to me, like pulling out and broadening that visibility for some of these students, I think does become eye opening, where it's like, oh yeah, like me just writing my my application here and deploying it into AWS, like that's it. It's up and running. Everyone can access it. And I'm worried about SQL injection and these types of things. But in reality, it's like, I mean, it's a huge map of multiple components that work together to make that a possibility. And being an older person in this field, I mean, I remember when it was just you racked and stacked a server, and you could point across the street and see the data center, and you knew like how like all you only had a handful of components that sort of worked with your application. Now it's like I think I mentioned the statistic this week. It's something like maybe 10% of your application was actually written by you, right? The other 90% is third parties, libraries, the framework, like all this other code, other people's code that gets pulled in to make your application, possible. So I think, pulling back and being able to see that entire picture is very important for those that are getting into the space. And again, something that I think all of us sort of take for granted, that it's like, yeah, we know, that it's a complicated, ecosystem that we have to sort of secure, but I think that's sort of foundational to how we understand security and how we understand how we protect that entire chain.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned, looking across the street, there's my data center. Like I sometimes refer to those as the good old days, right? Like, where's your data? Well, I've got two data centers. I've got racks in there. There's hard drives in there. My data's there, and of course, I probably have tape backups. There's data on the tapes, and those go to an offsite location. But I was able to, again, in one of my first jobs, if someone asked me that, I was able to say it's in that data center or that data center production or backup. And then, the tapes, those go to, so and so location. So simple, air quotes, about the
Quick little
data.
days.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Something else. So you've got an interesting background. You've been in a few industries. Um, I'd love to know. So you've been in the financial services side. Now you're in higher education. Going back to the challenge of data being used to make decisions, how have you found maybe the shift or maybe similarities between those various industries, the data that's collected, and then needs to be protected at that point?
Yeah, and I think it does come back down to the usage, right? I've been fortunate enough to work in the healthcare space, the financial space. When I was back in engineering, I worked in like the military space and commercial space as well, and now like in higher education. So I've seen a lot of different ways that technology is used, how things collected, and things like that. And I think when you look at like the healthcare industry. Data is obviously collected in order to provide better patient outcomes, right? For make better diagnostic decisions and put together treatment plans that actually affect somebody's life. Whereas on the financial end, what you're collecting there is more to make decisions about whether somebody's quite credit worthy, whether they have sufficient funds in their account to get a loan or whatever. The decisions obviously are made differently. They don't always have a life and death type of scenario in the financial end of things, comparatively to like the healthcare space. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have like real world impacts on people. And likewise in the academic space, I mean, it's a little different because we're not. The way I see it is that in the academic space, you are collecting data when you're students. You are collecting data about their grades and financial information, you know, in their progress towards their degree and things like that. But the way I see it is, it's not the same rapid decision making as you would see in the financial or healthcare space, right? So a lot of the data that's being collected is more about you know informing someone like an advisor, which I do, in my role, informing them about like, hey, should this individual take this particular class, based on their GPA, based on, how many credits they're going to be taking. So it's a little bit of a more analog type of decision making as opposed to where you see in healthcare space and financial space, especially in financial, where decisions are being made, split second, based on, a whole, collection of data. So it is interesting to see sort of the speed and the outcomes, right? Because healthcare, obviously, the outcomes there can be life and death. Financial could be the difference between you getting a house or not getting a house, and in the academic space, it could be a difference between you graduating in fall or graduating in spring, or even graduating at all, right? And all of those have real world impacts for the individuals. Some are more consequential than others.
It's funny how you kind of laid it out like that, because I think as people we've probably been in all of those personas. I know I have been. I'm actually going through the process of buying a lot of land. So there's there's the financial. I think back to my bachelor's program. I did have that. Am I going to graduate next semester or a year from now? And at that time, actually, now for buying the land, I know about, but for that time, I never really thought about the back end data, the ones and zeros that are helping not only me as the person that it's affecting, but also the advisors, the administrative staff say, oh, here's where Ward sits, here's where Ward needs to get to for his program, and here's what it looks like. Do you find, from a defender perspective, do you find any additional complexities in higher education when it comes to some of that analog type data?
I think relatively speaking, the data that gets collected in academia is less sensitive. It's not that it's less, that comes across as sounding like it's not important. I mean, it is, right? There's certainly student loan financial information, and certainly personal information about students that's collected, even like through email, right? I get a lot of email from students about different situations they're going through and things like that. That's sensitive information. But it doesn't, when you look comparatively to like the financial or healthcare space, you sort of see a distinction there between like the data being collected. What I would say is the biggest challenge with academia is that, the it's not a technology organization, right? Universities are not tech giants, right? They're not staffing massive IT departments that are there dedicated to ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, availability of data in the systems, right? It's usually, in some cases, even student workers that are part of the IT team. They're getting their hands dirty on technology while, building their education. And so, you don't see the same powerful like IT departments that you would see in other scenarios. And, that's sort of similar even in healthcare. Like it's the same sort of problem where like even in the healthcare space, like you're not financial industry, like a lot of the big financial companies they just throw money at any problem, right? Because they can, right? They know they can just burn through cash and they can, make the problem go away. Healthcare organizations, they're not that lucky, right? Maybe a little bit luckier than academia, but they have to be a little more cautious about their money. Whereas like in academia, again, it's you have a very skeleton crew, individuals that are often not seasoned, and that creates more complexity to how you actually defend and how you protect that data when you're working with perhaps not as shining tools as you would get in the financial industry, and you're working with individuals that just don't have a ton of experience. That I'm not taking away from anybody that works in academia in this facility, because I mean I know a lot of them, and my hat goes off to them. Because the work they do is still very relevant and very important. And I feel like most of them are working with one hand tied behind their back.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like there's a lot of organizations doing that these days. Unfortunately, even in financial services, it's getting tough out there. You know, to your own admission, you've been in a lot of different industries. You've had the pleasure of seeing that and doing a lot of that. Would love to hear more about your journey. What brought you, the last, almost 3 decades, we'll call it, from your start to where you are today.
Yeah, I never would have ever. I mean, we sort of said this before, starting to record here. Like, I never would have imagined that this is where I would be, at this time and age. But um, I had been around technology most of my life. My dad had worked at Commodore Computers way back in the day, and if you're not familiar with that,
Whoa. That's a blast from the past right there.
they were for the younger generation out there. They were a pretty strong competitor to Apple at the time. Apple had better marketing, I believe, and ended up winning out. Not that they had a better product, but I grew up with VIC 20, Commodore 64, 128. We had those floating around the house. A lot of prototypes, things that never really saw the light of day. So I was always around and always interested. My dad always brought me to work. where I would just sit and, hang out in the engineering department, when I was a kid. So I was always interested in that space. Eventually got into hardware engineering, worked at, Motorola, a couple other like military type of contractors, and really enjoyed that work. It was, to me, it was about, you could physically see the fruits of your labor, because if you designed a circuit board and you got it delivered, to your office, and you could open up the box and there's, what you have on your CAD system, a couple of weeks ago is now in your hand. And that was always, exciting. And, but, I decided to pursue software engineering, got my computer science degree, was writing code for several years, and eventually rolled into software security. A lot of it was because I sat on the other side of the wall from the security team. And that's where I, sort of caught the bug, and really saw that, it's an interesting space. It's always changing. We always I shouldn't say always, we're often behind engineering from a security perspective, which always makes you
Oh
feel
yeah.
like you're constantly trying to keep up. But that always, to me, feels like it's keeping you fresh. It's keeping you on your toes. And there's always new problems to solve, new challenges to try to tackle. And so that was really, of interest to me. And where I got my start in cyber security and software security was in the healthcare space. I was working at Siemens at the time, and see again like the complexity of, how do we do more with less, was clear as day, in that scenario where, these hospitals, they're not IT departments. That's not their core competency, right? Their core competency is, patient outcomes, making sure that, patients actually walk out of the hospital. And so being able to try to enable that and protect that ecosystem was very, fascinating to me. So, and then, got into the financial space, and had an opportunity to teach at Temple. I think I started about 7 years ago, actually, but just recently took over the director role earlier this year, to outline the cyber curriculum there for our College of Science and Technology. Um, so it's been, an interesting ride. And again, like, I would never, if you would, asked me 30 years ago, what are you going to be doing? I would not have chosen this. Or I shouldn't say I wouldn't have chosen this. I would not have said that this was going to be where I was going to be. It's been a very interesting ride, and I've been lucky, to be able to do this.
Yeah, and at first, I mean, awesome journey for sure, but going on that last statement, you wouldn't imagine. I'm gonna guess you're probably like me. You probably wouldn't have imagined you're working from home, talking to somebody, clear clear across the nation on a podcast. Like, again, not something I would have guessed either for my own career. So if you could have gone back, I was gonna ask back to the beginning, but, you kind of got, some mentorship from your dad and his job. If you could go back to that point where you were sitting, you mentioned sitting across from the software security folks. If you could go back to that time, you mean you were still, we'll call it IT, if you were still in IT, what, would you have given yourself any advice if you could go back in time? Is there anything you would tell yourself?
I think the one thing that, at least I'll kind of turn it into like the way I give advice to some of the students that are, coming out today. Because, to be honest, I don't envy a lot of them coming out of, this is a very brutal market right now. And I think that at least my timing in getting into cybersecurity was good, in terms of like the jobs were there. There was a lot of openings. There was a lot of need for cybersecurity. And whereas today, I think that's kind of flipped, where, now it's more of an employer market. We are churning out a lot of people in cybersecurity. There's a lot of people interested in the industry. And so, to be honest, like, a lot of the roles are being saturated. And so it's making it more competitive and difficult to get into those types of positions. And so, giving advice to, whether it's, myself 10 years ago, or even today, it's make sure that you stay, one, curious. I know that sounds very cliche, but, you have to have a curious mindset. You have to think about, especially as an attacker, or, if you are getting into the space, you have to have that attacker mindset. You have to have like, what can go wrong? We constantly have to think about, our threat model and understanding like what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it? And those are the two questions that you should be constantly asking yourself in every scenario you go into. So being able to stay curious and really understand what threat landscape looks like and how to do basic threat modeling is a critical skill. But also, for a lot of students that are coming out, like I try to tell them, you have to be able to show your work. Like that's and figure out what's going to set you apart from everybody else. And because again, like when I talk to a lot of people and doing mentorship, and or people just coming up and asking like, hey, I want to get into the cybersecurity space. The first thing I always ask is, why do you want to get into space, and what do you want to do? If you tell me what, if you answer the why question as, I want to make a lot of money, that's the wrong answer, right? But as far as like, what do you want to do? I know this really sounds bad, but to be honest, like I often cringe when I hear, pen tester or SOC analyst, because that's kind of the two things that everybody thinks of when they think of cybersecurity. You have to be somebody that's going to be able to break into systems, or you have to be somebody that's eyes on glass watching a panel of screens to see indicators of compromise. Both of those jobs are going to become fewer and far between in the future, and especially pen testing is saturated. Now there's a lot of people out there that are brilliant pen testers, people that are really putting in some like fantastic work in understanding how things work and how they can be broken. But to go to school to be trained to be a pen tester is or going to certification in classes, getting certification in pen testing. That's great, but you have to have that mindset. You can't do it because you think that that's what cybersecurity is. So a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I try to, again, kind of coming back to the what I was saying earlier about pulling back and looking at the bigger picture. Cybersecurity is massive. I mean, the amount of areas in cybersecurity that require skilled individuals is huge. And there's plenty of places where there's actually a deficit of people that are skilled to do that work, right? So I think it's really trying to change that mindset of there's more to cybersecurity than breaking and watching indicators of compromise. There's a whole world of security out there that is ready for people to jump in. I know that doesn't answer your question necessarily about what I would tell myself 10 years ago, other than maybe run more, read more, and do something good. But I've been really lucky making the decisions that I made. And I don't think I would have chosen any differently 10 years ago than I did today.
That's a great answer. Hopefully not going to put you in the hot seat with this question, but I am curious, and I'll give you a little bit about my background too to frame it up. You touched on it a little bit in your last statement. There's a lot of folks that are getting a degree. Big kudos first and foremost. I think going to universities and getting a bachelor's, a master's, or whatever is something to strive for. I myself have my master's, but back when I was going through it, um, you weren't nothing's ever assured, but you would get a degree. You were pretty likely to land a job. Now, it might not be immediate, but you were likely to have something. I was fortunate. I had an internship back when I was going for my bachelor's, so I was working full time my internship. I was working full time or working full time for my bachelor's. What advice might you give either? I mean, it could be people, currently going to college. It can be people currently unemployed and looking for their next gig. But what advice would you give to those folks that are looking? Because entry level doesn't really seem to be entry level anymore out there. You look at LinkedIn, you have all kinds of posts about Well, it should be entry level. It shouldn't be entry level, and I think it all goes back, at least in my opinion, to experience. So, what advice might you give those folks out there that are looking to get some real world experience?
Yeah, and I've actually done a couple conference talks this year on this particular problem. In fact, I spoke at RSA on the NICE framework and NIST NICE framework and how that aligns to individuals getting into particular jobs. So the reason why I bring it up is because I think the NICE framework actually outlines what is actually required from a task, skills, and knowledge standpoint for particular roles. And so I've been pushing more people that I talk to look at that. And one, it outlines all the roles, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's maybe 50 roles that exist in cybersecurity, and it ranges from security project manager to analyst and forensics and things like that. But in each one of those roles, it'll outline here are the tasks that are expected for that particular role. Here's the skills that you need to be able to demonstrate. Here's the knowledge that you need to have for that specific role. And that provides sort of a map for people that are looking to get into that role, and enables them to understand here's the expectations for that role. Let me build my portfolio around that. So you're not just stabbing in the dark and getting certifications that don't align to what you actually want to get into, or even worst case, chasing certifications for the sake of certifications, or chasing a degree for the sake of a degree. Not that those things aren't important, because they obviously are, but being able to demonstrate that work is going to take you further than just putting 10 acronyms after your name. What the NICE framework also does, and this is some of the things that I've been talking about throughout the year, is that on the job poster side, right, somebody that's the hiring team, it allows you to build a job description that actually matches what you're looking for. And I mean, I'm guilty of this as well. Like back in my hiring manager days, where we're looking for, let's just say, security architect. All right, well, where's the job description for the last time we hired a security architect? Give me that. I'm going to copy and paste, maybe make a little changes, and we're going to post it up, right? And the problem with that is that one, it's pretty generic. Two, if the way the market is right now, and to be clear, the hiring system is just broken at this point. But the way the market works right now is that if a company posts a job and says, "Hey, here's the role we're looking for a security architect," and it lists out, here's the tools that we use in this organization. Well, the automated systems will often look at the resumes of people they're posting, and if you don't have all of those tools, then you're tossed out, right? And so it doesn't the system right now doesn't allow for that more warm, hiring experience. It's more cold automated, that like the job seekers are just, they're getting certs because they think they need to get certs. And we're going to list all these, keywords to get past the automated system. And then on the other side, we have generic, job descriptions that don't actually align to what the actual role is on a daily basis. And you have these, mismatches where people that are more than qualified for a role get thrown out. And it just, the system is just not built for, the one we have today is not built for actually matching people up. I think, again, like if anything, we do live in a good time now where people that are looking for work can create projects, can create code, and they can post that, post it on LinkedIn, post it on GitHub, write about it, talk about the experience. We're living in this attention economy where that's what's going to get you more visibility, right? As opposed to the other 100 people that graduated, that year in that area with the exact same degree and the exact same certifications. You need to figure out a way to distinguish yourself.
I love it. And what was that framework one more time that you're talking about?
It's the NIST NICE framework, so NICE.
Love it.
And again, I think it's ever since I've sort of been diving into that more, it's been eye opening, especially from an academic standpoint, where like I'm starting to look at our program and saying, how do we align our program and the courses that we have to ensure that it aligns to these roles that exist in a nice framework, so that students when they graduate they can say, yeah, I can demonstrate these skills. I can show how I've done these things, and it aligns perfectly, well, not perfectly, but it aligns as close as possible to the roles that they're actually trying to get into.
Well, I know I'm gonna have to take a look at it. Definitely guilty. You mentioned job posters. You kind of just taking a stab and saying that thing. And man, oh man, it would have been nice to create some of those early job descriptions that were actually based on some sort of framework. And NIST is obviously a big name out there. It's kind of the de facto, if you will. So there you go, folks. NIST NICE framework. Go take a look. Whether you're looking for a job, whether you're posting a job, or just in general, it sounds like that's something everyone should take a look at.
Yeah, and again, I gave a talk about it at RSA this year, and it should be recorded and available.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Derek, if folks want to connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
LinkedIn is usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. Try to stay pretty active there. I do have a Substack, securely built. You can always go out there and check out some of the stuff that I've written there and reach out to me there as well. But LinkedIn, is usually the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. Well, Derek, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Ward. It was a good time.
Awesome. This has been another exciting episode of Guardians of the Data. Big thank you to the audience. We hope you enjoyed the episode and learned something today. Please tell others in your network to follow and listen. See you next time. That's a wrap on another episode of Guardians of the Data. Thanks for tuning in. For show notes and more, visit guardiansofthedata.show. Guardians of the Data is made possible by support from Centra. To see how we help organizations discover and classify all of their data accurately and automatically while quickly achieving petabyte scale data protection without the fuss, please visit Centra.io. Catch you next time.